Here begins the audiobook, Amazon, 1974. Written by M. Thor Hansen. Narrated by Marcus, a Google Play auto-narrated voice. Audio copyright 2022, M. Thor Hansen and Lava Publishing. Introduction. In the late evening hours of Thursday, June 27, 1974, one large and several smaller fireballs were reported from locations across northern South America. The objects were observed as far north as Costa Rica in Central America down to Peru in South America. Based on the first sightings, it was concluded that the parent object had broken the atmosphere over the border between Costa Rica and Panama. Eyewitnesses recounted how the body roared down through the upper layers of the atmosphere before breaking off some smaller fragments, which several claimed were almost catapulted out. There was uncertainty about how many parts broke off the body. Some said they saw 5 to 6 smaller fireballs, while others said 8 or 9. It was calculated from a shaky, uneven, and dark Super 8mm film shot by the Cortez family camping in the Colombian Amazon that the smaller objects were scattered over an area of 100,000 square miles, where they probably burned up. The parent object, thought to be a fragment from an asteroid orbiting the solar system, was estimated to hit the ground inside the Amazon basin. However, there was disagreement about exactly where in the jungle. Some scientists thought it crashed in Brazil's northwest Amazon, but the vast majority agreed it was headed for the Caquetá province rainforest in Colombia, some distance from the Brazilian border, but reality was playing tricks on them all. The greatest excitement and confusion of '74 was not the fact that a celestial object visited Earth. Meteors burned up in the atmosphere constantly, and sometimes they made it to the ground as meteorites. It was more the unexpected result of the visit. Scientists calculated from eyewitnesses and the imagery available that the parent object had so much mass left at the Earth's surface that it would create a violent kinetic reaction on impact. The impact blast, shock wave, and amount of dust and soil would have been detectable thousands of miles away. Earthquakes would have shaken the ground, and a vast crater would be evident when the area settled again. Impact material would have been flung up into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight around the globe and risking a nuclear winter. But none of that happened. Soon, news of this magical meteor spread around the world. I was barely 3 myself, so I don't remember anything. But in my research, I found a front page from a morning paper. It read, "Killer meteor vanished over South America." The article described how scientists were in disarray over the missing impact, and there were expert opinions from astronomers trying to explain the incident. If it had broken up midair, it could not have happened quietly. Even small meteors that disintegrate sound like a jet plane, breaking the sound barrier. The explosion would have cleared a considerable amount of rainforest, like the Tunguska explosion in 1908, where a meteor exploded 5 miles up in the atmosphere, clearing over 830 square miles of forest in Siberia. That blast was heard 600 miles away and created a few nights of unusual light phenomena. But no explosion was registered over the southern hemisphere, and no visible evidence found. It simply disappeared without a trace over the jungle. Several expeditions of both national and international research teams were sent to find an explanation, but all came back empty-handed. The episode is one of science's greatest unexplained mysteries. The novel Amazon, 1974, is my take on what happened in the skies over South America on that Thursday evening in June 1974. M. Thor Hansen. The beginning. Friday, August 19, 2016. Caquetá Province, Colombia. 12:53 p.m. A heat shimmer sparkled in the doorway of the small darkened steel shed. The door slammed into the wall with a typical clatter of corrugated metal. The gust threw up dust that swirled up and glinted in the light. The cool and still air in the shed, overshadowed by a 40-foot tall majestic flame tree, rose several degrees. The light struck the dozing Senor Foreman. He took his siesta in the shed every time the midday sun became so intense that a hard-working boss could not maintain commitment and action. So instead of snorting lethargic orders, he retreated in here until the sun was lower. At least, that was what he told himself. He leapt in the chair and twitched his legs, resting on the rickety table. Worse than the shock of being so brutally awakened was that in the surprise one boot nicked the bottle of life elixir, Ron Viejo de Caldas rum, so it tilted on its side, emptying its contents with nerve-wracking glugs over the table. Dazed, he jerked his legs to the floor and threw his upper body over the table, arm outstretched in a desperate rescue. He had to save enough until he could get into town later today. He raised the bottle, rescuing a few ounces of the golden-brown liquid as he watched the rest evaporate in the heat. Then he turned toward the door and caught sight of a small, hunched figure. "What?" he asked. Rodrigo, a thin and bony 62-year-old coffee plantation worker with a wind-bitten face, stepped forward, gasping for air. "Excuse me, senor, but..." "But what?" "You'd better come." "Now what?" He lifted his heavy body from the chair. "Isaac found something," Rodrigo said, looking down. "Something what?" Rodrigo looked up. "A thing, senor. He says it came up from the ground by itself. It looks very mysterious." With clenched teeth and a shaking head, he grabbed his hat of bleached, dried, and woven palm leaves, squeezed past Rodrigo in the doorway, and stepped out into the harsh daylight. At a brisk trot, the trip down the dirt path began 200 yards above the plantation itself. The dust puffed out beneath his rubber soles as they hit the ground firmly. Rodrigo followed at his heels, sweating like a whipped workhorse. "Does it have any value?" he asked. "I don't know, senor." A few minutes later, they reached the first part of the plantation and made their way among the dense, undulating, leathery leaves of the coffee trees. The grayish tree trunks strained to resist the pressure of the branches. The harvest season was approaching, so every branch was bursting with juicy, yellow-red berries. It had been a good year. "Over here," Rodrigo said, pointing. They continued southwest through the plantation. Soon they came to a clearing amid the throng of trees. In it stood a group of dark-haired workers, their eyes fixed on the ground, but they turned their heads as he and Rodrigo came crashing through the trees. He walked down toward the men in front, pushing them aside before squeezing between them. "Senor Foreman," said Isaac, "I saw the ground move and..." "What's going on?" he interrupted, but ceased when he spotted the mysterious object. The earth under the object towered up like a molehill. A gentle breeze caused a cloud of very fine dirt to rise and rotate into the air in a mini tornado. The surrounding ground looked different, light brown and pure compared to the rest of the dirt. He realized there were no stones, branches, leaves, or other impurities in the perimeter, only very fine, almost milled dirt. He took a step forward, but Isaac caught him by the upper arm. "Look out, senor." Manuel got too close before and sank into the loose ground. "Quicksand." Isaac pointed to a deep footprint near the object. "Right there." Irritated, he pulled his arm from Isaac's grip and walked as close to the edge as he dared. It had worked itself up from underground with such force that the surrounding terrain had been pulverized. "El Topo Furioso, the furious mole," said one worker, pointing. He wondered for a second, but then realized the parallels that could be drawn between the little half-blind furry creature and this seemingly artificial entity from the bowels of the earth. Both were cylindrical, but this had conical ends, 10 inches in diameter and 2 feet long. The surface reflected the sunlight with a strange bluish color like waste oil, and yet not blue, more reddish-brown, or was it more like purple? Light blue mini discharges of electrical voltage followed by a crackling sound ran across the surface, and a faint but detectable tremor caused the fine dirt to slither in waves down the edges of the mini hill like avalanches in the snow-capped Andes. Each time a discharge occurred, a nauseating smell of rotten eggs rose. The foreman moved around the perimeter, eyes locked on the object as he dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief. On the other side of it, a deep dent with a transverse rod across it broke the smooth and uniform curved surface. He squatted down and squinted his eyes. Symbols were engraved across the 1-inch wide rod. He was not highly educated, but he had gone to school enough to read, but the signs were unrecognizable. He stuck his hand into the fine dirt and picked up a handful. It felt like flour in his sweaty hand and trickled effortlessly down between his fingers. He tossed the dirt again and rubbed his palms hard together, leaving sticky clumps of dirt. Then he straightened his back and pushed himself up with a sigh. For a minute or two, he considered the situation while the workers eyed him expectantly. This is interesting, he thought, but unfamiliar, with no value in the traditional sense. No gold, precious stones, or other easily marketable items which could sweeten his life or the lives of his workers. And yet, something about the object sent a chill down his spine. Suddenly, and with no warning, Oscar screamed. The young man went down on his knees with a pained expression and hammered his palms up to his ears, squeezing. Rodrigo, the most seasoned of the bunch, pushed his way to Oscar, kneeled and grabbed the young man's shoulders. "What's going on, Oscar?" Oscar, the youngest of the workers at just 21, was blessed and cursed. He was born with super hearing and could hear a cockroach hissing from 60 feet away. He had some mutated sensory hairs in the inner part of his ear that allowed him to pick up high-frequency sounds far above the 20,000 hertz that ordinary people could register. Oscar looked up at Rodrigo with bloodshot eyes, from which tears of pain trickled. Suddenly the young man dropped his hands again, his body went limp, and he slumped exhausted. "What is it?" Rodrigo asked. Oscar breathed deeply and rose to a sitting position. "Didn't you hear it?" he asked hoarsely. "Hear what?" asked the foreman. Oscar looked red-eyed up at him. "That loud noise, like Morse code." "No, Oscar, we didn't hear it," Isaac said. "It must be your sensitive ears that have picked up a high-frequency sound," Manuel said, extending his hand and pulled him back on his feet. "Are you okay?" Rodrigo asked. Oscar seemed a little wobbly, but tried to force a gentle smile on his lips. "Yes, I'm fine now, but I can't help wondering about something, Senor Foreman." "Wonder about what?" "Well, Senor, it sounded more like a call signal than anything else." "Call signal?" Isaac asked. "Yes, as if it called for help, calling home to Mom and Dad and asking to be picked up." For a while, the foreman stood silent, contemplating the situation, while the others debated which mythological or demonic creatures might come rushing out from among the coffee trees to bring home the thing. Then he took a deep breath and decided. He squinted his eyes and held out his hand to calm them down. They stopped their heated debate. "I'll go to Puerto Selva and talk to the police chief. He must know who to contact." He found Isaac and Manuel. "You two stay here and guard the thing. Oscar, come and get the rifle. The rest of you go back to work." The workers turned in a flash and scattered into the plantation, like rats swooping down the mooring ropes of a burning ship. The foreman took out his cellular phone from his pants pocket and snapped some pictures of the object. Oscar followed his boss. The foreman opened the boot of his green 1984 beat-up, two-door hardtop Land Rover. He lifted a gray rolled-up blanket, and from it, he unrolled a Remington Model 700 rifle and handed Oscar the weapon with a determined gesture. He accepted it, a little reluctantly. Then the foreman handed him a box of bullets. Buck hunts with his uncle had taught Oscar how to handle a rifle. That was not the problem. It was that thing. What if it started making those hideous noises again? It was unpleasant and cut right into his brainstem. The foreman moved around some old canvas bags and wooden boxes in the cargo space. "Here," said the foreman, holding up a pair of old red lacquered earmuffs. The muffled sound of the foreman's voice penetrated the muffs. Oscar heard him say, "Now you can still hear if it's sending out a signal without it hurting your ears." "Okay," he said in a raised voice, giving the foreman a thumbs up. Senor Foreman slammed the trunk shut, got in the driver's seat, and started the engine. Oscar stood for a moment, watching the old Land Rover as it bounced and danced its way up the pothole dirt road. Shortly afterward, it disappeared into the surrounding green forest. Then he slung the rifle over his shoulder and began his walk down among the coffee trees with heavy steps. Low in the early night sky, the first stars appeared, sparkling. The 3 guards sat on the ground, waiting. After an uneventful afternoon, Senor Foreman had not yet returned. They had lit a fire 15 feet away from the mole. It hadn't made a sound except once, 3 hours ago. Then it had sent out its distress signal again, and Oscar's hearing protection had worked well. The mole's sound convinced him once again that it was an intelligent and deliberate signal. This time, he was better able to listen to the high-frequency rhythmic tones as the earmuffs reduced the painful parts. Both of the other men had looked at him as his eyes widened and his fingers followed the rhythm. Isaac and Manuel could still not hear the signal, only listen to his description. The mole was silent now, and he had in a fit of audacity removed his earmuffs. Oscar had used the rifle once, but not to defend himself against intruders. Instead, he had shot the head off one of 2 gray-brown rabbits. The skinned carcass hung and roasted over the small fire on a makeshift barbecue spit between 2 Y branches. With his Swiss Army knife, he cut a chunk of meat from the animal's thigh and handed it to Isaac, who gratefully accepted the charred meat. "He should be back soon," Manuel said as he reached for some meat. "Yes, this is getting tiresome," Oscar said, smacking his lips. "I have a date with Maria tonight, and if I don't get my act together soon, I'm going to risk that jerk Juan Jose running off with her. And he thinks he can get away with it just because he's Naldo Villegas's nephew," he thought bitterly. "Yes, it would be a shame to lose such a lovely girl," Isaac said. "If only I were 20 years younger," said 43-year-old Manuel teasingly. "Me too," Isaac grinned. "Hey," Oscar said, smiling. He knew very well that his 2 older colleagues were only joking with him. Both men were married to wonderful, warm-blooded senoras who could keep them busy and satisfy their every need. An hour later, night enveloped them and laid its black pall over the landscape. Oscar let his eyes drift across the clear, star-studded night sky. A thick cloud cover often lay over the region, but this week had been cloudless except for a few passing showers. He sat disgruntled at the idea of Maria, in the arms of a well-satisfied Juan Jose, running his disgusting pink tongue up her neck as she giggled and let him. Manuel lay on his side and snored loudly. Isaac was aimlessly slashing at a branch with his knife. Oscar grabbed another knot from the woodpile and held it to the fire. His peripheral vision caught something that made him stop. The hills and the forest were almost inseparable in the darkness, but where the forest allowed the road to appear for a moment, he saw 2 encouraging sets of headlights. "Isaac," he said, making a nod toward the lights as Isaac looked up. "Manuel," he tried to wake the sleeping man, but Manuel just twisted around to lie better on the hard ground. Oscar jabbed the knot into his side, waking his friend with a start. "What?" Manuel sat up and rubbed his eyes. He clutched his ribs and apparently wondered why his side was aching. "Is something happening, Oscar?" Manuel asked in a yawn. "Cars up the hill. They'll be here in a few minutes." "Good," Manuel said, "because I'm going to." Crack. They shrank in fright and looked into the darkness of the coffee trees. Quickly, they got to their feet and stood with every muscle so tense it almost hurt. Manuel broke the silence. "An ocelot?" "No," Isaac whispered. "It weighs too little to break something so loudly. If it's a cat, it's more likely a mountain lion." Oscar turned around in concentration, his rifle pointed rigidly at the trees. Then, in one swift movement, Oscar turned 3/4 around and halted. He tightened his finger on the rifle's trigger. "It circled us," he whispered, squinting his eyes to better distinguish the few outlines between the trees. He took a step forward and lightly squeezed the trigger, letting it slide a millimeter closer to firing. And then suddenly it sprang from the trees and charged toward him. All he could register was that the beast wasn't huge, so he lowered the rifle and let his finger give the decisive jerk. A short shriek that faded into deadly silence followed the noise of the rifle. All 3 stood for what felt like hours before daring to move toward the attacker. Isaac was the first to overcome the terror and approached. It lay motionless just a few feet from them. "Be careful," Manuel said. Isaac crept closer. He bent over the cadaver to identify it in the sparse light. Oscar and Manuel stood nail-biting, waiting for information. With a roar of laughter from Isaac, the mood lightened for them all. Not knowing what had triggered his immediate joy, they hurried over to their colleague. "Look," Isaac said, smiling, pointing his finger down at a furry creature. "It's just a rabbit." They breathed a sigh of relief and started laughing, tears streaming out of their eyes and down their cheeks. On the ground in front of them was a dead, killed by a single projectile through the body, gray-brown rabbit, likely the mate of the one they devoured with great relish earlier in the evening. Manuel put his hand on Oscar's shoulder, squeezed it, and looked at him. "Good shot, buddy. You should be a sharpshooter for the military with your skills." The three of them stood giggling for a moment like a bunch of schoolgirls as they made up grotesque and vivid stories about how the dangerous rabbit would attack, maim, and kill them with its big front teeth and fiery red eyes. It would then move on to the next village, where it would wipe out the entire population as it grew larger and larger. They were so engrossed in their fantasy world that they barely registered the new electrical voltages manifesting on the surface of the mole. Only when a strong, hideous odor hit them from behind did they turn around to see the coffee trees shake violently. Their smiles stiffened in disbelief as leaves and coffee berries on the trees exploded out on all sides from a forward thrust. And it wasn't from a rabbit. The Land Rover raced down the last part of the dirt road, followed by a newer Toyota four-wheel drive police car, with the police chief and two officers in it. Dr. Luis Fernando Moreno was a passenger in the Land Rover on a seat with a broken suspension. The molded foam had crumbled from moisture and heat over the past 30 years. When a wheel plowed into a pothole, he raised a few inches off the seat and then knocked his bony backside down on the steel frame beneath the warm, light brown leather. Not the best form of travel he'd experienced in his 58 years of life. His own transportation, when he ferried himself to and from work as an archaeologist at El Museo Nacional de Colombia, Colombia's National Museum in Bogotá, was an always polished, mailbox red 2012 two-door Renault Clio with a customized 1.2-liter, 75-horsepower engine. It got him the 4 miles through Bogotá's busy and sometimes traffic-clogged streets without sore buttocks. He looked down through his horn-rimmed glasses at the white tailored suit and light striped cotton shirt with matching tie, not field clothes, and in the glare of the rear driver's headlights, he noticed his pants were already filthy from the Land Rover's dirty cabin. He gripped the grab handle on the roof tightly and turned towards the foreman behind the wheel, who seemed untroubled by the bumpy ride. Suddenly the brakes were jammed on, and he was hoisted up in his seatbelt as the wheels skidded some feet across the ground. "We're here," said the foreman, pulling the handbrake with a crunch. All five gathered in the beam of the police car's headlight. Their shadows flickered across the grass. "It's down there," said the foreman, pointing toward the plantation. A quarter of a mile down, the orange-red glow of the fire flickered between the treetops. The officers turned on their flashlights, ready in front of the group to guide them through the enveloping darkness of the plantation. "Shall we?" asked the police chief. The moment they moved, a rifle shot boomed up over the canopies. The foreman looked in bewilderment at the police chief. "Go!" shouted the chief. They set off running, the officers with guns drawn. At the edge of the plantation, they split into two groups, one police officer in front, with the foreman and Moreno right behind. The police chief and the other officer ran together. They worked their way rapidly down through the enclosing coffee trees. 300 feet from the clearing, they heard a brief and intense noise, massive branches breaking in rapid succession, then another sound that made their blood run cold. They paused for a moment as a deep roar reached them. Turmoil replaced the roar, men's voices shouting, men's voices screaming. By the time the officers broke into the clearing, the campfire was split apart, with smoldering remains scattered across the area. "Stay behind the officers," said the chief, signaling for the officers to search the area with their lights. Moreno felt more comfortable behind an armed and trained man, so he quickly latched onto one officer. He followed the police officer as he searched the area with his flashlight. At first there was nothing to see. That soon changed. The light hit a tree dripping blood, the thick red liquid oozing from the leaves and running down the trunk like syrup. "Over here," called the police officer. They gathered around him. Suddenly, a low, rumbling snarl sounded behind them, and the officers aimed their lights toward it. They saw nothing but a small mound of earth. Moreno remembered the foreman's story about the molehill, but it was empty. "The mole is gone," he heard the foreman say. At that moment, embers caught the dry grass, and a ring of fire immediately encircled some trees. They turned toward the burning trees, and there in front of the fire's glow appeared the outline of a huge four-legged creature. Before they could analyze or grasp the situation, the creature leapt toward them in a lightning-fast movement. It was bear-sized, dog-like, but moved with the agility of a cat. They immediately fired their weapons. "Dr. Moreno, this way," shouted the foreman. He ran after the foreman and let the officers deal with the attacking animal. Behind him, he heard the popping of guns. He stopped between the trees and turned around. The officers' handguns flashed again as they emptied their magazines. They seemed to hit the mark, for the muscular animal changed its behavior, whirled around and leapt into the shade of the trees. He widened his eyes. Something had separated itself from the beast. It crashed to the ground and continued at high speed toward the officers. The elongated thing stopped only a few feet in front of them. "That's it, the mole," said the foreman, pointing. The sound of the beast faded away, and a last faint roar confirmed it. Dr. Moreno stepped out from his hiding place, looking nervously over his shoulder. He ran over and bent down and picked up the mole. It was heavy with a strange, rubbery surface. In the flickering fire, the mole seemed more matte black than the changing colors the foreman had talked about. But all in good time, he hugged it to his chest and walked back with long, quick strides toward the relative safety of the coffee trees. "My men," said the foreman. "Okay, people, let's find those men and get the hell out of here," said the police chief. Moreno remained in his hiding place while the search went on among the trees. Shortly after, one officer shouted, "I've got a mutilated body over here." The other officer looked under his heat-shielding hand, down between the crackling trees. "There's one more over here, dead." The foreman approached Moreno, shaking his head. "Then we are one short, doctor." The officers searched for a few minutes before the police chief came to Moreno and the foreman. Black sweat cascaded down his face. "The fire is spreading fast. We have to stop now or we risk burning in it." The foreman's shoulders slumped, and he nodded resignedly. The chief whistled for his men and motioned for them to leave. They had walked a short distance when Moreno stopped. He thought he heard a faint sound, mixed with the crackling of the fire. He shook it off and ran a few more steps. No, there was something, a faint cry. "Stop, I hear something." The police chief turned around. "What?" A voice. "Over here," said one officer, slanting in among the trees. They followed him and soon found a man lying on the ground. "It's Oscar," said the foreman. The young man's t-shirt was ripped open, and deep gashes, like a set of giant claws, covered his chest. The beast had ripped one upper arm down to the bone. Tear marks down his bloodied face made him look like one of Freddy Krueger's victims. He was battered, but alive. A roar resonated among the trees. "It's coming back," said Dr. Moreno. With Oscar wailing, the two officers pulled him up, and they fled up through the plantation. The trees were moving, branches and leaves rustled near them. A mixture of burning vegetation and a stench of rot enveloped the area. Their primal survival instinct took over. Wind carried the smoke uphill between the trees, and almost blindly, they continued forward in the smoke. With the help of an adrenaline-fueled rush, they made their way through the plantation. They ran, knowing it would be certain death if they hesitated in the slightest. The uppers of Oscar's shoes made two fine trails across the ground, where the officer struggled to drag his half-conscious body toward the cars. The foreman reached his Land Rover and threw his body into the front seat. Moreno ripped open the passenger door and jumped in next to him, with the mole in his arms. The car got started, and they spun around in the small space. The Land Rover drove past the Toyota at high speed. The police chief watched in the rearview mirror as the officers hurled the young man into the cargo area in an indecent and not amnesty-approved manner. Oscar wailed loudly as the officers pushed his legs in and closed the tailgate. They jumped into the car, and one shouted, "Drive." The chief hit the accelerator, turned the Toyota around, and sped up the dirt road. His eyes shifted from the road ahead to the rearview mirror. In the vibrating mirror, he saw the trees shake. A massive shadow materialized behind, lit red by the taillights. Seconds later, a metallic crash sounded from the rear of the car, and then a large dent appeared in the roof. He immediately felt a weight increase in the car's response. Then the rear window exploded, and thousands of glass fragments rained down. Oscar screamed in a mixture of fear and pain as a giant front leg swung a colossal set of claws through the shattered window. It sliced through the air inches from his mutilated body. The police chief activated the four-wheel drive and sped up. Right front and rear wheels took turns hitting a hole in the dirt road. The recoil sent the beast flying, and the claws disappeared out of the window. In the rearview mirror, he saw the beast hit the ground and spin around before he refocused on the illuminated road ahead, while the injured boy chanted, "6 claws, 6 claws, 6 claws." Day 1. Monday, August 22, 2016. Washington, D.C. 8:14 a.m. The shiny black Cadillac Escalade, with tinted windows and U.S. government plates, was speeding south on 21st Street Northwest and turned right down on 8th Street Northwest. A moment later, it disappeared into the university parking garage at George Washington University. The car nosed into a parking space where it stopped 2 inches from the wall with a squeal of brakes. The front doors opened, and 2 men with expressionless, chiseled faces stepped out. They were dressed in black and, despite the overcast Washington day, wore sunglasses. The doors slammed with a loud bang, the locking system gave a click, and a few beeps rang out between the walls of the cold gray garage complex. Then they set off at a brisk trot. The receptionist smiled welcomingly. "Good morning, gentlemen." She was quite aware of her charm as she blinked her dark doe eyes a few times. "What can I do for you today?" One man, taller, broader, and older than the other, took off his sunglasses. He then reached under his jacket and took out his identification. "Special Agent Braun and my colleague Special Agent Waterfield, Secret Service, ma'am." She was no stranger to having law enforcement officers around. The FBI, CIA, NSA, and the Metropolitan PD, the local cops, often stopped by when they needed expert advice from the scholars at the university. An arrest or two was inevitable when you concentrated tens of thousands of unique personalities on 43 acres of land, like here in Foggy Bottom. She remembered the last time the Secret Service was here. It was a security circus, because the president had come by on an official visit to give a pep talk to the young people about pursuing hopes and dreams, showing perseverance, diligence, and keep working hard. It wasn't a failure if you didn't score the highest marks every time, if only you gave it your best shot. He had talked about how to use their young intellects to make America a better place, where even the weakest felt they had a place in society, and much else she did not remember. She lifted herself from the chair and tilted her head to glance past the broad-shouldered agent. "Is he with you?" she asked. "Who, ma'am?" asked the handsome black Agent Waterfield. The more experienced Agent Braun knew the answer and said, "No, ma'am, the president is not with us. We are here on another errand." Of course, a bit embarrassed, she dumped her bottom back into the seat. "We're here to talk to Professor John W. Archer," Braun said. "Archer?" she asked. The agents looked at her and returned her surprised expression. "Is that a problem?" Braun asked. No, not at all. It's just not Dr. Archer that gets asked about the most." She folded her hands and nodded slowly. "After the incident with his wife, you know." Braun nodded. Waterfield stood with a stone face painted on. "Well, gentlemen," she said, standing up and stretching out her arm, "you're going for a stroll in the basement." The 2 agents followed the receptionist's instructions and found themselves in an old basement. They followed the mold-infested peeling walls down the dark hallway. Moisture leapt from the walls, and cobwebs stretched between rusted steel pendants in the ceiling pulsed back and forth in the wind that whipped through the hallway. "What was it about him and his wife the woman talked about?" Waterfield asked. Professor Archer was a close friend of the president and destined for a not insignificant post in his administration in 2008. What happened? One Saturday night, a few weeks before the election, he drove his wife and child to their deaths on their way home from an event at the president's house. Although he claimed he had only had a glass of wine and a small brandy all evening, he fell asleep at the wheel and crashed into a tree at 50 miles an hour. The two were killed instantly, while Archer himself survived with scratches. They took a blood sample, didn't they? Yes, later at the hospital. And they detected virtually no alcohol in his blood, Braun said, and no narcotics in his system. He looked at Waterfield's questioning face. "You're wondering where the assumption about the booze came from?" Waterfield nodded. An anonymous phone call to 911 said Archer had driven from the party in an intoxicated state, and the officers that caught up with him explained the car veered from side to side before the crash, like a classic DUI behind the wheel. "He was never convicted?" asked Waterfield. Braun shook his head, but his reputation had suffered irreparable damage. Braun stopped at a door with a sandblasted window and an almost invisible nameplate. "This is it." He knocked and waited a moment, then he tried again, a little louder. Waterfield looked at the frosted window. "It looks dark in there." Braun clenched his hand into a fist and knocked hard 3 times on the door. "Professor Archer, are you there, sir?" "No, I'm not," a voice called down the corridor. They saw a figure wandering with a Starbucks paper cup in one hand and keys dangling from the other. Over his right shoulder hung a brown leather bag. The man was in his late 40s with thick brown and tousled hair. There was something melancholy about the dark blue eyes with fine lines underneath. The blue Levi's, light blue shirt and slack blood-red tie like a hangman's rope around the condemned man's neck gave, together with the man's hunched posture, the impression of a man who had been challenged to a battle and had lost. The brown leather shoes he dragged beneath him were dull and in need of a dab of shoe polish. John William Archer wondered who on earth was knocking on his door at 20 minutes past 8 on a Monday morning. They looked serious-minded, reminding him of the agents who swarmed when he was involved in getting the president elected all those years ago. "Professor John W. Archer?" asked the elder of the two. "The same," he said, examining the supposed government people. "What can I do for you?" They presented their IDs. "Special Agents Braun and Waterfield, Secret Service, sir." "May we come in?" "Yes." He opened the door, found the light switch, and they entered. "If this is about that op-ed in the Washington Post, I believe I was very polite and did not threaten the president." "Our visit has nothing to do with threats, sir." "Well, okay. Won't you sit?" "Braun, I seem to recognize that name. Didn't you work under Edward Young?" "Yes, sir, I did." "I'm afraid I can't offer you coffee because my machine broke down yesterday, so this is all I have," he said, raising his paper cup, "and it's filled with sugar." "It's all right, sir," Braun said with a dismissive wave. "Well, what can I do for the Secret Service?" He made eye contact with Braun, then tried Waterfield, but the man was lost in the drawings on the wall and the posters with strange notations. He followed the agent's eyes, which had now reached the yards of shelves with books and old things that adorned the office, clay pots, shapeless objects, chubby human-like figures of stone or clay, and dozens of dusty scrolls. Waterfield became present again and looked at him. "What are you a professor of, sir?" "I have a PhD in archaeology, specializing in pre-Colombian linguistics and writing," he sighed, "and once was of use here." "You don't teach anymore?" Braun asked. "Well, sometimes they let me," he said with a wry smile. "So you can read what the ancient Greek gods wrote?" Waterfield asked. "I think you have me confused with a historian, Agent Waterfield. The gods have left us nothing in physical form we can dig out of the mud and study with analytical curiosity. No, what you're thinking of is those who describe the gods, such as Homer. My specialty is more the Mesoamerican and South American cultures, of which the Mayans and Aztecs are the best known. It is the use of pictograms and ideograms, images that represent a concept or a concrete thing or action, that I spend my time on. It's quite an exciting field. Take this jar found in Peru. He lifted a red glazed jar. Look at the symbols here. You'd think they... Did you check your email this weekend, sir? Braun interrupted. My email. He internally checked his somewhat absent-minded memory. No, why? Then he squinted his eyes and peered at the two agents. Why are you here? Do you know a Dr. Luis Fernando Moreno from the National Museum of Colombia in Bogota? Yes, good old Lou. What's up with him? He sent you an email with a video clip attached Saturday night. Did he? Archer felt elated that his old friend had reconnected. It had been 10 years since they had been on a dig together. Before the accident, before his breakdown, before President Phil Boomer bought him back his job at George Washington University. The rumor was that Boomer had gotten some dirt on the dean's wife. Personally, he didn't care, but he paid a high price both professionally and personally. The price he paid was a promise not to represent the university externally. But that was the way things were. With his history behind him, no one would ever hire him again. My old friend Lou, he pushed the unhappy thoughts back into the mental prison, where they were locked away with a heavy chain and padlock. Yes, sir. Do you have a computer? Papers cluttered his desk. Magazines and scientific journals were strewn everywhere. Several weeks' worth of the Washington Post had been tossed right where he'd finished them. He gathered the papers into stacks. I'd better clean it up someday, he thought, tossing a handful of papers onto the floor. A newsboy cap slid the same way. Waterfield picked up the cap and put it back on the table. Thank you, he said, the same time as a beige computer mouse appeared from under an issue of Archaeology magazine. He followed the tail in under an unfolded old book. Triumphantly, he lifted the spine, so the book folded with a snap. A battered IBM ThinkPad laptop emerged. He pulled the PC over, lifted the lid and turned the machine on. It responded with a loud hiss from the fans, until they found their natural speed. When the machine had booted up a minute later, he opened a browser and found in his favorites the link to the university's online mail system, where he typed in his username and password. The two agents were now standing on either side of him, following along. The webmail listed all his mails, 143 unread. He looked embarrassed at Agent Waterfield. I guess I'm not the best at getting my mail read. There, said Waterfield, pointing. Luis.f.moreno@museonacional.gov.co, with subject, New Exciting Find. Eagerly, he clicked on the email with an attached zip file, and in the text field Moreno had written a greeting. Dear John, I am overly excited. An incredible discovery has been made in a coffee plantation. I've made a little video to explain more. Best thoughts to you, Luis. He downloaded the file and clicked on MOV012AVI. An older version of VLC Media Player started up, and Archer ran the image full screen. Then he leaned back in his chair and became one big smile as his friend appeared. Dr. Moreno held out his arms and got his nose right up into the optics so his pores stood out. Then he adjusted the camera angle and sat back in the chair. With eager gestures, his old friend reported in English with a thick Spanish accent. Dear John, today I have experienced something amazing and rather scary. I was called earlier today to Puerto Selva in Caquetá province, down south, right on the edge of where the Amazon starts, where... Lou stopped himself, and his face took on a more suffering expression. But that's not at all what I wanted to start with. I was sorry to hear about your wife and son. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. I tried to contact you during that first year, but there was never a response to either phone calls, emails, or letters. So I assumed you weren't interested in sharing your grief. I hope you are well now and settling into your new life." Archer smiled reluctantly at the screen. "Whatever it means to you, I never believed the drunk driving allegations. Have you got any certainty about what happened?" His friend paused, as if waiting for an answer before putting his horn-rimmed glasses back in place. "Well, I'll stop asking questions I won't get answers to now anyway. Back to the matter at hand." On the screen, Archer and the agent saw Moreno looking at his wristwatch. "It's now 1:30 a.m. here in Bogotá, and you're an hour ahead in Washington, so you're probably sleeping soundly, but I have such an urge to call you." "Then do it," Archer said, smiling at the agents. "I'm not sleeping anyway." "As I was saying, I got a call about what I suspected would be an important archaeological find. In a coffee plantation in Caquetá province, near the volcanoes, Gemelos del Diablo, the Devil's Twins. From the description, I felt it was extremely important that I saw it immediately. They therefore requisitioned a helicopter to fly me to Puerto Selva. There I met the police chief, who introduced me to the plantation's foreman. The foreman spoke eagerly about the object which had emerged from the ground. Lewis's eyes sparkled with excitement as he recounted the trip, the men's screams, the fire, and the struggle to escape a monster of indescribable dimensions and agility. The local first aid station in Puerto Selva would not take responsibility for young Oscar, so we had him stabilized for the helicopter ride. I took him to the hospital in Florencia and had him admitted to intensive care before continuing back to Bogotá." Luis looked thoughtful. "I really hope the young lad makes it." After a few seconds of silence, he said, "Well, let me show you what I found." Archer saw his friend get up from the chair and move the camera over to a steel table where a black cigar-shaped object lay. "As I told you, dear John, this emerged from the ground by its own power in the middle of the coffee plantation. I have only made a few preliminary examinations. It is 60 centimeters, 24 inches long." "You don't have to convert to inches. I can use metrics just fine," he thought with a smile. "It has a diameter of 25 centimeters, 10 inches, and weighs just under 10 kilos, 20 pounds. The surface is almost a greasy rubber coating to the touch, yet hard as steel. There are no visible joints or openings. The foreman of the plantation told me that there used to be electrical discharges across the surface, and that the color changed between what he called psychedelic colors. However, I have not witnessed this myself. In my presence, it has had only this matte black surface. It was also said to give off a rancid smell." In the picture, Luis Moreno stuck his nose right down to the surface. Lou's nostrils vibrated as he sucked in air inches from the object. "A faint smell of rotten eggs. I think the surface gives off chemical hydrogen sulfide when exposed to electrical voltage." The camera was turned onto Lou's face. "I don't think this is an archaeological find, as it doesn't resemble any of the artifacts we've previously found from Mesoamerican Indians and early Europeans. The reason I thought of you, my friend, is the inscription." He focused on a crossbar above an indentation on the object's surface. "It appears to incorporate a carrying handle, but the most interesting part is here." Luis zoomed in, and the autofocus moved slightly back and forth to focus on the characters. The image settled. Archer moved his upper body over the table, so his face was closer to the screen. He pressed pause on the video. Archer studied the signs for a minute or two before leaning back in his chair, shaking his head. "Unfortunately, old boy, I've never seen it before." He took a sip of coffee and turned his gaze to the agents. "Can I get a screenshot, do you think?" "I think," said Waterfield, stretching his hands past him, "that if we press these keys it will make a screen dump." He pressed the Shift and S keys. Then he opened the Paint program and selected Insert, and like magic, the image from Moreno's video popped up. "Thank you. Well, let's see what else Lou has for us," he said, resuming the playback. "See if it gives any meaning, John, and call me as soon as you get a chance. My number is in the email. I am going to stop for today, but I know what to do with my weekend." Lou smiled tiredly. I hope to talk to you soon, my friend. The video player went black. Archer returned to the email and got his phone out of his pocket. He squinted to read the phone number in the email as he began typing with the thumb of his right hand. 0057. Sir, Braun asked. He looked up. I'll call him. I know it's only 7:30 in Bogota. You can't, sir, Braun said. No problem. He doesn't mind. You can't reach him, sir, Braun said, looking at him with regret. Dr. Luis Moreno is dead. Archer's eyes widened. What? That can't be right. I'm very sorry, sir. He let himself sink into the seat. A few seconds ago, he was on a happy and fresh walk across a beautiful snowy landscape, enjoying every impression and the excitement that was building up in his body. But suddenly the ice broke beneath him, and he fell through into the frigid water. Waterfield, get the professor a glass of water. With a trembling hand, he accepted the glass. Was it an accident, or? He was killed, sir, Braun said, torn apart in the same way as the victims he describes from the plantation. So they don't know who or what did it? No, sir, not yet. He drew a deep breath into his lungs and held it there for a moment before exhaling again with a loud groan. Then he rose and offered his hand to Braun first, then to Waterfield. Thank you very much for taking the time to bring me the news, gentlemen. You're welcome, sir, said Braun, but I'm afraid that's not all we came for. Archer looked puzzled. What more could there be? Please sit down again, sir, and I will explain, said Braun and gestured at Waterfield to do the same. Braun pulled out a chair when his cell phone rang. He let go of the chair and took the phone out of his jacket pocket. He looked at the display. Excuse me for a moment. Archer nodded. Agent Braun. Yes, I'll wait. Archer took a clear amber-colored pill bottle out of his bag, took out a pill and put it on his tongue. Then he took a sip of water and swallowed with a distinct gulp. What are you taking? Waterfield asked. Pills against too much stomach acid. If I forget them, my stomach boils and I get a hell of a heartburn. He screwed the lid back on and rattled them back into the bag. A giant belch surprised them both. Sorry. The pills put a layer of foam on top of the stomach acid, but they also develop a lot of excess air, and there's only one way out. Waterfield smiled indulgently. Yes, sir, they heard Braun say into the phone. No, not yet. We were just getting to that, sir. Yes, a moment, sir. Braun turned around and held out his cell phone. For you, Professor. He picked up the phone and put the speaker to his ear. Wondering, he said, Archer. John, old friend, said a bold voice. It's Phil Boomer. Phil, he said. I'm sorry. I mean, of course, Mr. President. What are titles between friends? Friends. Yes, John, I still consider us friends, so call me Phil, please. You have a twisted view of what friendship is, he said, breathing deeply. When he spoke again, his voice was hard as steel. Where was your friendship when my car was wrapped around a tree? Where was your friendship when my beloved Bridget and my dear Thomas lay dead in their coffins? Where was your friendship when your entire camp distanced itself from me, froze me out of the campaign? Where was your friendship when the dean visited me with a pink slip? I got you rehired, Boomer said, though without the pride in his deep voice that was one of his hallmarks. Archer felt his head turn red. It was only because Elizabeth Boomer got so annoyed at your lousy treatment of me, with the real threat of divorce, that you made it work. I am truly sorry about Bridget and your son. You know I really cared for them. It's okay, he said. He didn't want to discuss it further. What can I do for you, Mr. President? Well, John, Boomer said, I want you to gather a discreet team of people you trust and go to Colombia for me. Colombia? Yes, I want you to find out what that thing is. I'm sorry, but I don't quite see what interest you have in Colombian domestic affairs, sir. Boomer was silent for a moment before saying, The signs you see on the thing. Yes. It's not the first time we've seen them. Where else? They are in a communique from a scientist who was in Colombia's Amazon rainforest in 1974. Ask Agent Braun to give you the document folder." He looked at Braun in wonder. "I should ask you to give me the document folder." Braun pulled a rolled-up plastic folder out of his inside pocket. The transparent folder contained a piece of dark and rough fax paper. The sheet comprised the same type of characters as in the screenshot, but handwritten and in a myriad of variations. On the top of the sheet was stamped, "Top Secret." "Did you get it?" Boomer asked. "Yes. Besides the sheet you see there are about 50 more," Boomer said. "It came with a letter from a Colombian doctor who was treating an American named George Livingstone. Dr. Livingstone, along with 3 other scientists, was investigating how the Augustine volcano, which had erupted 80 years earlier, had affected the flora and fauna in the base's vicinity. The doctor who wrote the letter says local farmers in the area found Livingstone bruised and comatose halfway down a stream about 3 miles from the volcano. The day before, the volcano had stirred, causing powerful earth tremors that had triggered huge landslides. The American's camp was razed to the ground with no other survivors. In hospital, he lay for days talking in feverish tones. He muttered about mysterious signs, spaceships, and advanced technology from alien worlds. One day he woke up and was lucid. That's when he asked the doctor to fax his explanation, along with the sheets, to the U.S. Geological Survey and the White House. "Spaceships?" Archer asked without conviction in his voice. "Yes, that's what he said." "But spaceships?" he asked again. "That was investigated, wasn't it?" "Yes, the government sent a team, but after 3 weeks they had found no trace of either American scientists or any extraterrestrial activity. Livingstone had gone completely mad." "But wasn't it in the summer of '74 that a giant meteor burned over South America?" "Yes, John, Thursday the 27th of June to be exact. As I recall, a large fireball and several small ones were observed." "But where did they go, John?" Boomer asked. "They found no meteor residue or crater from the biggest of them. I talked to a NASA scientist this morning who told me that based on eyewitness accounts, the main meteor should have left a crater bigger than the one in Arizona. But they found nothing, John, nothing." "What became of Livingstone?" "He died a few hours after talking to the doctor." "But why this sudden interest by the American state and your side?" Through the loudspeaker, he heard the president run his fingers over his gray-streaked Van Dyke beard, like a man who didn't know how to play his next move. After 10 seconds of silence, Boomer said, "All this is top secret, you understand?" "Yes," he said, rolling his eyes. He'd shown nothing but blind loyalty to the state. "The fax from Livingstone details a distressed vessel of unknown origin." "That sounds fanciful enough, Phil." "But think, John," Boomer said, "if this were a vessel from another planet, what technological achievements it might contain. Perhaps it could give us the means to solve all the world's problems of hunger, drought, and energy problems. Maybe send us in the right direction with CO2 emissions and global warming. Not to say leap 100 years into the future technologically." "But that was investigated in '74, wasn't it?" he asked. "Yes, it was," Boomer said. "That piece of paper you're holding was supposed to be a technical description of the spacecraft. It was scrutinized, but they didn't have the same resources available then as they do now, nor imagination, I guess. Engineers and others tried, according to the records I have, to assess the validity of Livingstone's story, but they finally agreed that it was pure fabrication, spun by a sick mind. All documents were classified as top secret, filed, hidden, and forgotten." "Forgotten until this weekend." Boomer paused for a long moment, then humbly said, "You are our brightest mind in this field. Will you do it for me, John?" Archer looked at the paper with the strange characters. He recognized none of it. There was nothing from his 25-year career that could compare to this, not from extant or extinct civilizations. There was apparently a connection between the artifact Lou had found and the fantastic story Boomer told. His fingers itched. For the past 8 years he'd been sitting here in his basement room, turning into a mummy, an ancient corpse that the new archaeology students on campus could have fun excavating. He had become an outcast, ostracized by the profession, and ostracized by the faculty, except for a few colleagues who either held on to the friendship from before the accident, had joined later, or just felt sorry for him. It was that small core he would take with him to South America if he accepted the assignment. Frankly, he needed to get out and feel reality against his body again. For too long, he had been moping around, had become soft, vapid, and useless. And Boomer, though he might have had ulterior motives for the expedition, was right in his assumption. No one, absolutely no one in the entire world, was better at solving mysteries of unknown writing than him. "I'll do it, Boomer, but not for you, for Louis's sake, and his alone." "I'm glad, John," Boomer said, "but just one more thing." His elation dropped again. "There's always just one more thing." He sighed so loud that Boomer could hear it. "Those you bring must be kept in the dark about the expedition's primary aim. You'll have to tell them you're going down to investigate your friend's death and the artifact he found. An archaeological expedition. That's also the cover story for my staff. Feel free to mention me, but as it stands, only you, I, and the Deputy Director of the Secret Service, Samuel Otto, know the real goal of this expedition. I'd like it to stay that way for a while longer. And no press, okay?" He looked at Braun and Waterfield, then said solemnly, "Yes, Mr. President. I've arranged to transport to Colombia and the opportunity for you to get through customs easily. My office will cover all expenses, so just let me know if you need anything. I would have loved to visit you in person today, but I'm on my way to Miami." "It's all right," he said. "I'd probably have thrown you out anyway," he thought. "Once again, thank you very much, John." He hung up and handed the phone back to Braun. Then he let his eyes slide down the sheet of signs. In the right corner, a symbol caught his attention. It was a black square box composed of a bunch of little black and white squares. It looked out of place but seemed somehow recognizable. His eyes drifted to the coffee mug from Starbucks. The same symbol was printed on the mug, just with the squares placed differently. He looked at the agents and pointed alternately at the sheet and the mug. "Tell me, gentlemen," he said, "did Starbucks coffee come from the same people who wrote these signs?" A smile curled the two agents' lips before Waterfield explained. "No, sir. The mark on the paper is what we call a QR code. It's not part of the original document, but applied by the printer. All old White House documents are scanned into a database and the original destroyed. Anything stamped top secret is subject to a strict security protocol. It can't be copied, either on photocopiers or digitally, without registration. Digitally, all documents are protected by digital rights management encryption, where only the owner of the matching certificate can read it. Each time such a document is printed, an individual identification number is imprinted in a QR code, which identifies that unique piece of paper. Each time the document is displayed on a screen, a QR code is inserted. If the file is copied or sent over the network, it is logged with an ID code. The system records every time the document is viewed on a screen, printed, or copied, and by whom. This document is the President's property. Therefore, we must bring it back so Boomer can produce it in an internal investigation. Now, for example, if you scanned this piece of paper into your PC and then sent it to a recipient by email, a network scanner somewhere would at some point scan the QR code. Then there would be two documents with the same ID, one on paper and one digital, and then you'll be in trouble. Archer's mind wandered around all the technical information. He understood little. He only used his PC for some one-finger Google searching, email, and news when he remembered to turn it on. He still had his unbreakable Nokia 3310 phone and was proud of it. "Terribly cumbersome," he muttered.